Here at Ritual, we know that a mother's support isn't limited to one day a year, and we believe that yours shouldn't be either. So this Mother's Day, we're honoring the world's biggest supporters with science-backed daily rituals that center you not just today, but every day. Whether you're thinking about motherhood, actively trying, or already there, we've got you covered for when it matters most. From fertility support and natal choline to our best-selling clinically backed prenatal multivitamin, know that you're getting clean, traceable key ingredients in bioavailable forms. Because let's be honest, you don't have time for guesswork. Find your ritual. Go to ritual.com/podcast and for a limited time, get 40% off your first month. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Based on net sales from industry data, including Nielsen IQ, Stackline, and Numerator as of Q4 2024 and top 5 products.
Welcome back to Drafting the Past. I'm Kate Carpenter, and this is a podcast all about the craft of writing history. In this episode, I'm joined by historian Dr. Omar Valerio-Jiménez.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Omar is a professor of history at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where he is also an associate dean for graduate studies. He originally worked as an engineer before going back to school to become a historian, and his work focuses on histories of Mexican-American civil rights, citizenship, education, and memory. His first book was called River of Hope, Forging Identity and Nation in the Rio Grande Borderlands. And his second book, which we talk about in this interview, is Remembering Conquest, Mexican Americans, Memory, and Citizenship. It came out last year, and it has been honored with several awards. Remembering Conquest explores the collective memories of the U.S.-Mexico War and how those memories motivated civil rights campaigns among several generations of Mexican Americans. Omar is a pleasure to speak with, and his thoughtful approach to his work came through in our conversation. Keep an ear out, especially for his work log system, which I just might have to try out for myself. Here's my conversation with Dr. Omar Valerio-Jiménez.
I will say that I began writing as a historian, I guess, in graduate school. And early on in my graduate career, I was invited to write these 2 essays or 2 entries for an encyclopedia. That sort of was my foray into writing for a general audience. And I really enjoyed that. You know, it has its pluses and minuses, obviously, like like academic writing as well. But I've continued to accept those requests to write for general audiences, like anthologies that are more geared towards, a general audience, or op-ed pieces or things like that. And I would hope that those kind of experiences have improved my writing. And so I think I'm fortunate that I had those early experiences. But I also worked with a very good advisor who was an editor himself of a journal, and so that also helped me. Although we can talk about it later, but there was some pluses and minuses, because when you're in graduate school, you have more doubts about your writing, right? And so when my advisor would return chapters, and sometimes I remember once he returned a chapter and he had line edited sort of 2 pages, and I had given him 25 pages, and he just said, "I'll just stop here because I think there's some real serious problems." And I felt so defeated, but eventually we got over it, right? But anyway, so throughout my career, I've published in various, avenues. So I have 2 monographs, right? And several anthologies, some for a general audience, others for more academic audiences, and then as well as articles and encyclopedia entries. And so that, I think, has helped me overall. Sometimes, and actually I should mention one other thing that I would like to sort of develop now. Several years ago, I got invited to write a chapter for a book targeting middle school students. And I thought I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't sure whether to accept, but I did accept. And that was a really good learning experience. And then since that time, I've heard of other academics, right, who have written children's books. I mean, this wasn't really a children's book. It was more towards a younger audience than what I usually write my essays or chapters on. but I had a good time. And I also learned that sometimes my writing is geared to a more advanced audience. And so I had to figure out how to choose different words and use shorter sentences and so forth. And I thought that also helped, that helped me understand, sort of keep your audience in mind, and I've always sort of thought, well, there's a general sort of adult audience, and then there's an academic audience I had never really considered. What about middle school children, right? So that helped. I think the other thing I would say is that I've learned that writing this second book, the second monograph, was not as difficult as the first, although I think I confronted a different set of challenges. For instance, there are more demands on my time as a faculty member than as a graduate student, and as an assistant professor, right? So I had, yeah, and you're starting from scratch. You're not starting from a dissertation, right? So there's more time management issues. Then there's also the because you're out in the world on your own. You haven't really had. You have to actually actively seek feedback. You don't have a dissertation committee, right, to give you feedback, or a dissertation advisor. So that was, those are some obstacles that were different. But I think I also had, on the positive side, I had a better understanding how the publication process worked. I was a published author, so I had a little bit more confidence than when I was, than in my first book. And I also had just generally more writing experience overall. So I remember a professor in graduate school, Joyce Appleby, who was a colonial U.S. historian. She's passed away. But I remember her telling us, as we were her students, saying, writing never gets easier. And I think on some level that I knew what she meant now, and it was, I think she was saying it just to let us know that writing is difficult regardless of where you are in your career, right? For some people. And she was admitting something that was perhaps admitting something to us that we never would have imagined, right? Like, oh, we think the great Joyce Appleby, she'd be an incredible writer and very well published and so forth. But she was saying, it's still hard. And I think that was hard. That was, I think, for our benefit to say, look, when you're struggling, we all struggle with our writing. And I think that was a useful lesson.
Well, we are going to come back to your background a little bit more in a minute. But first, I'm going to ask you all these practical questions.
Sure.
So when and where do you like to do your writing?
So I thought about this question, and I think one of the things I'll say is that this has changed over the years, right? And throughout my career. So as you can imagine, in graduate school, since I was much younger, I could write late at night. I wasn't married. I didn't have a family. I could pull all-nighters if I had to. And that obviously isn't the case anymore. I'm older. I cannot write at night. I cannot pull an all-nighter. But in graduate school, I remember writing wherever. I could write in coffee houses, in libraries, on trains, or whatever. But at my age, I have to sort of know my limitations, right? And so I've tried to stay flexible as I've experienced several changes in my life. So, for example, when I had a postdoc and I was commuting back and forth, I was recently married and I was commuting back and forth to see my wife who had a job in another state. You sort of write where you can, right? But getting married, getting your first tenure track job, having kids, all that sort of changes your routine. And so I'll say this, that there's been times when my children were young and, took up a lot of our time. And I was a faculty member and my wife is a faculty member. We had, very little time to write. And I remember, I'm not sure if someone gave me this idea or I heard it somewhere, but I decided I'm going to start getting up an hour early before everyone else gets to sleep, gets up, and trying to write. And that really helped, because then I got up, I would write, and then I would try to write. And then eventually, an hour became an hour and a half. And I don't think I ever got to 2 hours, but, but that helped a lot. And I've used it, since then. I've used that routine since, occasionally, like if I have certain deadlines, right? And I can't find the time because of meetings or teaching or my children, looking after my children. So I also these days, I can't really write in coffee houses. I can't unless I'm forced to. So I usually generally write in the morning. I prefer to write in the morning after I walk my dog, and I write at home. Usually, I write in my study, or sometimes if my wife isn't home and my dog and I are the only ones home, I'll write it, at the kitchen table. But I generally try to write. How do I say this? Away from people. I can't write in coffee houses anymore unless, like I said, I'm forced to, and then I'll have to use headphones or something because I'll start listening to other conversations and I can't tune it out very easily. Or worse, bad music, and I can't handle it. So that's how I do it. And last year I spent the academic year in Providence, Rhode Island, and I took a few trips by train up to Boston, and I had such a wonderful time riding on the train that I sort of envy the people who can do that because of their daily commute. I just thought, oh, this is such a wonderful experience because there was people on the train, but I don't know, they weren't, at least the trains I was on, they weren't carrying on loud conversations, so I could focus. And then just something about moving, along on the train that just, I don't know, it was sort of very calming. But back to your original question, I think I generally write in the morning. And I generally write, in my study at home.
I'm now, as you were talking, I was fantasizing about booking a trip on the train from Kansas City to Chicago, just as like a moving writing residency.
Yeah, no. I mean, I first did that when I was in graduate school. I took a train from Las Vegas to Sacramento, California, and it was in the winter and there was snow on the ground, and I just thought, oh, this is lovely.
What sorts of tools do you use to organize yourself?
So that also has also changed since I am an old person. I have, I never did use note cards though, so that I'll say that. Thankfully, I never did, but I did make lots of copies, right? In graduate school, it was before digital cameras were widely available, and then I started using digital cameras, right? And now it's my phone to take photographs, right, of sources when they're permitted. And when they're not, obviously, use your laptop. I use my laptop, but it's a combination. I've used for my last book, for Remembering Conquest, I organized some of my sources with Sotero, but also wrote down a lot of things, by hand, not by hand, on the computer, and had files. I also had scanned images of either PDF files of newspapers or documents, right? Whenever they were available at a library or in an archive, or photographs. But I didn't have a very good way of organizing my photographs. So I kept sort of an index. I kept an index of like, this photograph has this information, and this photograph is the second part of that document or whatever. And that got very unwieldy, right? And so when I heard about Tropy, I started using it, and I'm using it for my current book. So I'm still learning to use it. So I'm not an expert, but I think that's just a wonderful tool. And I'm also using, I don't know if I pronounced this correctly, but I'm using DevonThink to sort of organize my sources, PDF files, and my written sources as well, and to use links and and to sort of cross-reference things, use tags. So that's so useful. And occasionally I still have a copy, a physical copy, but I try to scan those in so that they're available whenever when I'm traveling. I don't have to be trying to look it up, or trying to, carry it with me.
Where in your research process do you like to start writing?
I think, well, I love to do research. So one of the things that is always a temptation is to do more, right? To do more research before you can start writing. But what I've learned is that deadlines are a great way of sort of motivating you to start writing. And so I have used deadlines, whether they're for conference papers, right? So I intentionally say, I'm going to apply for a panel, to be on a panel or something, when I'm not quite sure if I'll have enough material, right? But that will force me to say something with the material that I have. And I think that really helps. But other times, it's been deadlines where someone has invited me to contribute something to an anthology. And then I think, okay, I think I can do that. I'm going to have to take a section of this chapter that I'm working on, and I'm just going to have to polish it for, for this anthology. And that really helps. And one of the things I know is that I used to think if I do that, then I won't be able to use it for my chapter. But one thing I've learned is that even when you take like a section of a chapter to use as an article or as an anthology chapter, that by the time your book comes out, it's going to be very different. So you will have changed it as well. I mean, so there might be some paragraphs that are similar to what you've already published, but generally it's going to be different. Some paragraphs will be moved around, or there'll be a different emphasis, for the overall chapter. But what I will say is also that there's been times when I have started writing while, take on a research trip. Like if I take a research trip for a week or something in the summer and I find something great in the archive, I will then that evening start writing and just say, wow, this would be a great vignette, for example. So I'll start writing the vignette. And, it's going to go through several iterations, right, before it sees the light of day. But when you have that inspiration, is just a great time to write, I think, or at least it works for me. And then there's other times when I'm in the archives and I find something, and it might not lead to sort of a structured paragraph, but it might lead for me to create like a file where I brainstorm, where I say, oh, maybe I can use this document to make this point, or to link it to this other chapter, perhaps link two chapters together, right? Or emphasize a point that I've made in another chapter. So I'll say I'll begin writing as soon as I sort of find inspiration in my sources. But in terms of sitting down to writing a chapter, I don't really wait necessarily, like to have all the research done. I sometimes just start and say, I'm going to start writing, and then we'll see how far I get. And if I don't get very far, or if I get to a certain point, like, half the chapter, and then I realize I need to do more research, then that's useful as well.
It leads well into my last practical question, which is, what is your approach to revision?
So for revision, one of the things that I try to do is I try to revise as I write. So if I've written, let's say, 10 pages of a chapter, and I will try to edit those 10 pages at some point before I finish the chapter. And especially during those days when I'm having trouble writing. So when I have trouble writing, one of the things that I've sort of allowed myself to do is to say, okay, if I'm having trouble generating new paragraphs, then let's shift gears and let's do something else that will still contribute to making progress towards this chapter. And one of those things is editing. And so if I'm having trouble writing, I'll edit, what I've previously written. And that sometimes gets my sort of creativity going, or reminds me of like, oh, that's where I was saying, that's what I'm trying to say. And therefore the next time I sit down to actually write, some new paragraphs, it will be a little bit easier. So that's how I do it. And then of course, when you finish the chapter, I also then go and print it out and then edit the whole thing again, right? And or when you send it out to friends or to a writing group or something, that's when you also edit it, after they give you some feedback, right? So I think I would say my editing process is sort of, there's multiple stages of it, right? There's sort of your everyday or weekly editing that you do as you're just trying to get stuff out. And then there's editing after you finish something and you just edit the whole thing.
So I'm eager to know, in preparing for this interview, I learned that before you were a historian, you worked as an engineer, which I didn't know. Yeah. How did that background shape your approach to writing? So
that's a really interesting question. And I'll tell you that it's something I've never thought about as former engineer. I did have a graduate colleague once when I was in graduate school ask me something about engineering, but it was because she was in sort of studying the history of science and she had some question. So I answered her questions, but I've never wondered about how engineering shaped my writing until you posed this question. And I'll start by saying this, that as you probably know, most engineers don't do a whole lot of writing, but there is sort of an approach to how we tackle problems, right? How we think about problems and how we think about solutions to problems. So I imagine that must be in some ways how I approach writing. I don't know. I haven't really considered it and sort of analyzed that. But I will say, I mean, engineers or, people in STEM are usually very sort of focused on data, right? And one of the things that I left out of your previous question is that I keep a log, a writing log, right? And so I use I think it's the Pomodoro method, right? Where you write for a certain amount of time. In my case, it's 40 minutes. And then I take a 15-minute break or 5-minute break, and then I do another 40-minute session. And then after 2 sessions, I take a longer break. And I also make sure I reward myself with something, after I've completed whatever number of sessions. And I keep a writing log of what I do every day. And call it a writing log, but I also keep a log of other things like I spent this amount of time in email or whatever. And I think that sort of obsessive deep attention to detail of like jotting down like what I've spent my time on is probably from my engineering past, right? Of like logging things and like keeping tabs of like the minutes or whatever. But I think in my case, the log has really helped, and I've been doing it for many years, and it helps remind me because like other people, like a lot of scholars, we have short memories about what we do ourselves, right, on a weekly basis. And if I don't keep a log, or there would be days when I forget to enter things, and then I'll think, what did I do for the past 2 days that I did get to my writing? And then I think, oh, I had this faculty meeting, or I had these emails, or whatever it is that you had to do or prepare for a class. And that helps me because it sort of keeps me honest, and it helps remind me, oh, I didn't get that done because I was doing all these other things. But it also helps me because it helps me remind me like, okay, if for the past 2 days, I haven't had structured time, then I need to structure that time for my writing. So the log is a log, but it's also sort of a set of goals, because I'll say for tomorrow, or at the beginning, sometimes it's at the end of the day, I'll say tomorrow I need to do this. I'm going to try to do 3 sessions or 4 sessions or whatever. At the most, it's probably 4. I can never do more than that unless I have a deadline. But, I need to do 3 writing sessions. And I also have to do all these answer emails or attend this meeting. And it helps me sort of set sort of these daily goals. One of the things that I'll add to this is that I think that my exercise routine, and I thought about this for a while, so let me see how I can say this. My exercise routine is sort of part of my writing routine. And let me explain. So I run, weekly, or I'll swim, or I'll just walk, right? And when I do these things, when I do this exercise, it helps remind me. Well, first of all, at least running, swimming not so much, but running, I get inspiration and I get ideas about my writing. So when I go for a run, I don't necessarily think about my writing, right? But somewhere along the run, I might remember something I was trying to struggle with, and then I get an idea. And it's not uncommon. It happens a lot to me. Whether it's an idea of how to interpret a source, or how to restructure a paragraph, or restructure a chapter. And I've always found those really wonderful, to be a wonderful experience. But the other way is that, there's days when I wake up and I've told myself I'm going to go running, and then I feel tired, or or it's too cold, or here in Texas, it's usually too hot, and I don't want to run, right? But then I remember that I usually feel really good once I get out that door. And once I start running, or after I complete the run, I feel great. And so I try to take those kind of ideas into my writing. And I say, you know what? I might not feel like writing today, but think about when I do exercise. Sometimes I don't want to do it, but after I do it, I feel really good. And so, and the other example I want to say, the other comparison I can make with, exercise and writing is that with exercise, I know that sometimes, like, I don't necessarily go running and say, or swimming and say, I want to establish a certain pace. I just say, I'm going to do a certain number of miles, or, or swim for a certain number of minutes, right? And it's the same thing with writing. I'm not the kind of person who works well when I tell myself I'm going to write a certain number of words or a certain number of pages. But instead, if I say I'm going to write for 40 minutes, that will help. And with exercise, right, when I run, it's not so much how fast or whatever, it's just going out there and doing it because it makes me feel good, but also it helps build my strength, right? My endurance in running or swimming. And I think it's the same. I tell myself it's the same thing with writing because it's not so much the volume that you produce, the amount of pages or the amount of words. It's that you devote this time to it. And by devoting that time, you sharpen arguments, you sharpen ideas, and you just become better as a writer. But it's about logging that time. And I think so. This is once again going back to the engineering part of me. I think that whole process of logging and sort of writing down like the minutes or whatever, that must come from my engineering background.
To take a little closer look at his approach to writing his latest book, Remembering Conquest, I picked out a passage for Omar to read for us. This section comes out of the introduction. Here's Dr. Omar Valerio-Jiménez reading from Remembering Conquest, Mexican Americans, Memory, and Citizenship.
So on a long drive across Texas to attend my aunt's funeral in Matamoros, Christy, my oldest niece, started a conversation about the war with me. She had spent several years living in and attending school in Mexico, where my brother, her father, had worked for several years. By 1993, when our conversation occurred, my brother's family was living in Arlington, Texas, where Christy was a third grader. When she understood that I was in graduate school to become a historian, she told me about her experiences attending public schools in Mexico and Texas, and then asked a question that was much harder to answer than any that had preceded it. She explained that when she was in school in Mexico, the other children, Mexican nationals, would associate her with the invading United States when discussing the Texas Revolution and the U.S.-Mexico War. But once in Texas, the other students perceived her as Mexican, so they blamed her for the Alamo and the U.S.-Mexico War. Christy wanted to know why this was the case. I recognize her question as one that Mexican Americans often encounter as they try to situate themselves in relation to past events. However, I stumbled to provide a satisfactory answer. My niece's questions led me to complicate the European American versus Mexican version of events that she had presented by explaining Tejano's role in the secessionist struggle in Texas and the subsequent U.S.-Mexico War. I explained that the United States had waged an offensive war against Mexico to obtain the latter's northern territories, and that Mexicans living in these lands had become Mexican Americans after the war. But I sensed that Christy was not completely satisfied with my explanation. Her question, I realize now, was also about identity. While I offered my interpretation of historical events, my answer did not address identity directly. She was trying to understand the paradox of being a Mexican American and of being caught between two nations. My conversation with Christy illustrates how the U.S.-Mexico War continues to influence the identities of Mexican Americans, which is part of its legacy.
You know, I really appreciate here how you foreground your family's experiences in this introduction. How did that shape the project?
I think, as probably other writers have told you, you write the introduction and the conclusion of your book at the end, right? When you know what you've already said, right? So it's in some ways the easiest part to write. In my case, I really enjoyed writing the introduction because I could include my family experiences, and because my book is about collective memory and about how collective memory is passed on from one generation to the next, I thought, wow, this is great. Now I can use not only, for example, my father's collective memory of the war, my siblings, and now the next generation, right? My niece. I thought this is one way I can sort of explore that, these, how generations pass collective memories to one another. So I had some of these stories or some of these collective memories in the back of my mind when I was writing the book. But it wasn't until I wrote the introduction that they all came together, that I realized, like, oh, I can use them all in different ways. And so partly because as I was writing the book, I was reading about history and memory. I was reading scholars who've written about these topics, and I was thinking about how do I use some of these concepts that I'm learning about from these scholars in my chapters. And then these family experiences sort of found their way into the introduction and into sort of making a point about how we use collective memories, how we use them strategically, how our understanding of the past sometimes very much differs from someone else's understanding of the past. And so that's how those stories came to the introduction, right? I think there were stories that I ran across in several, in primary sources that reminded me of my family's experiences. And so that also helped because not that I took this primary sources and I interpreted them for their own sake, right? And I placed them in historical context, but it reminded me, oh, my family has had a similar experience, right? And then I would write. So, like I said, I keep well, maybe I didn't say this already, but I keep a file of just sort of brainstorming ideas for each chapter. So I'll have chapter 1 and I'll say, oh, I had this idea, and I'll just write it down just so I don't forget it. And so I would have those kind of ideas. Like I would say, oh, I just saw this source and this reminds me of my dad's story, or this reminds me of my niece's story. So that's how I would say it influenced my book.
As you just mentioned, a big part of what you're doing in this book is that, of course, you tell readers what happened, what the historical events are, so that they can follow. But you're also talking about how those events are remembered, often in conflicting ways and over spans of time, which seems like kind of a lot of things as a writer to try to juggle and write clearly about. There are lots of layers of meaning and memory. How did you keep track of all of that?
That was tough in some cases, but the easiest part I would say is writing about what happened, right? Like writing about how a certain journalist or a certain activist, Mexican American activist, wrote about the war or the treaty. So my book makes this general argument. One of my arguments is that the U.S. Mexican War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, helped motivate Mexican American activists to press for civil rights reforms across 5 generations. That's the basic sort of big argument that I'm making, right? And they do this very strategically in many cases. And that's what memory scholars have sort of explored, like how is collective memory used strategically or used for social and political purposes in different at different times. So describing sort of, okay, this is what happened. This is what this newspaper said. This is what these activists said, or this is what this civil rights organization did, is sort of the easiest part. But then trying to exploring how they interpreted the war or the treaty, or how they strategically used their collective memories of the war and treaty, and how they might have used it in contradictory ways, right? That was a little tougher. But whenever possible, I try to look for secondary sources that might have also used a similar primary source. Like if it was a well-known political figure or well-known activist, right? And that activist had written this some source or some pamphlet or given a speech, and other people have written about this, other scholars, then I would try to look at that, what they said as well, sort of as confirmation for, am I interpreting this the right way? Because in most cases, there isn't an easy way to confirm how I'm interpreting their view. So that's how I sort of confirmed or became a little bit more confident in my interpretation of these conflicting views of the war and treaty whenever they were conflicting. I mean, sometimes, say, an organization or the members of an organization, or at least the sources that I was able to obtain for this organization, didn't necessarily show any conflict within the members, and so then I didn't have to explore that. But occasionally there were, like for instance, the various activists that were involved in the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. They didn't all necessarily agree with sort of the LULAC's official stand on certain issues. And I think that was really interesting to explore. But other people have done that for different purposes, not for what I was doing.
I was also really interested in how you organize the book, because you do it by generation, as how you describe it, and how each sort of subsequent generation understood the U.S.-Mexican War. How did you settle on that organization? Did you start with that, or did it come about as you were working on the book?
I think it came about while I was working, but it came about early on, because one of the things I started writing or started doing research on with the sort of the most easily available sources, right? So some memoirs, some oral histories that I knew about and I could obtain. And this was for this 20th century portion of my book. And so I realized early on that there was these big differences in the way certain groups of people or organizations were thinking about civil rights issues, because the civil rights issues that were important in the, say, 1930s are going to be different than those sometimes that are important later on in the 1950s or 1970s. But so that was one thing that I realized, like they're emphasizing different things, different civil rights issues. But another thing is, so for the 19th century, for example, right in mid 19th century and afterwards, there's some of the civil rights issues are the loss of land for Mexican Americans, and how the various elites, especially whether it's in New Mexico, California, or Texas, they start losing land both through legal and illegal means. And so that's a big civil rights issue, as well as lynching becomes a civil rights issue in California and in parts of Texas. But later, there's going to be, say, school segregation as a more important or more pressing civil rights issue in the early 20th century. But I will say that the other thing that happened is, in my field, in Mexican American history, there have been various scholars who have used a generational model to make these distinctions between how one generation thinks about a political issue and the subsequent generation thinks about it. But then finally, so I was familiar with that generational model from my own field, right? But finally, one of the things I was exploring, as I mentioned earlier, is how collective memory gets passed along from one generation to another. And so that sort of helped. But it was also, once I settled on it, it was easier to organize my work, because I could think of, okay, I'm going to think about the 1850s to the 1880s, right? As, or 1840s to the 1870s as one generation. And then what's the next generation? And it also helped me because then I could find where were there holes in my knowledge and in my research, because for certain sort of generations, I didn't know that much about what were the pressing civil rights issues. And so I had to go and look for that information. So that, it helped me in my research as well.
In the last part of our interview here, I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about your own influences and inspirations, and also advice passed along. So one of the reasons actually I've been excited to talk to you is that I know from our conversations and also from hearing from your former students that you are a dedicated teacher and a thoughtful teacher and mentor. How do you talk about writing with your students?
So I'll say this. I had the privilege of working with as I mentioned before, a dissertation advisor. His name is Norris Hundley Jr. at UCLA, who was a past editor, or was an editor of the Pacific Historical Review. He was very good at giving me at editing my work, right, and giving me suggestions, and so I try to do that for my students. I line edit their work whenever possible, and then I give them suggestions, right? But I also, as I've obtained suggestions on writing, I also pass along those suggestions to them. But I tell them, there isn't one way to do to write. There isn't one way to come to your conclusion or come to your thesis, right? There are multiple ways. And I tell them what I learned in graduate school when I asked my advisors, like, if I'm writing about this issue and someone else is writing about it, I'm not going to be able to say anything different. And they would laugh and say, if you get 10 faculty in a room and they're always going to disagree about something, and you get 2 people or 3 people to read the same source, you're going to have different interpretations. So don't worry about it. So those kind of lessons, that kind of advice, I pass along to my students as well. But I also give them the advice that I've just sort of shared with you about what works for me. And I tell them, it might not work for you. And I also say, and there's times when some of this advice has worked for me, and other times when it hasn't. I can't always wake up early to write, but I've tried to be flexible. And I tell them, be flexible, be forgiving. And I guess that's another thing, another lesson about writing is that I think nowadays I'm more forgiving with myself about, if I didn't get, 10 pages done this week or whatever, I tell myself that's okay. Whereas early on, I was a lot more critical, and I would say, why didn't you do it? And I would feel bad about myself. And now it's just like, oh, partly because I keep that log, I say, well, I didn't write 10 pages, but I got some more research done, or I got some outlining done, or whatever, right? So I try to see the positive more. And so I tell them to do the same thing.
Are there people who you turn to regularly for feedback on your work?
Yes. So actually, since when I was in graduate school, I had a writing group, and then I also had my advisors, right? Nowadays, so I didn't do that for when I was finishing my first book. I relied on conference presentations and sometimes presentations at my own university, like faculty forums or whatever, right? But nowadays, I started relying on a writing group again. And I find that really, really helpful. And I've tried to, I helped start a writing group on a topic that, I'm working on now. And that has really helped because it's a new topic for me. And so I try to find people who were already working on that. And so it was sort of a bit selfish. I was like, well, I'm going to try to find people that already know more about this than I do. And luckily they agreed to join. and their feedback has been tremendous. So that's what I do. The other thing though, is that I've learned from someone who is an amazing scholar in my field and a MacArthur winner. She once was on a panel at the Western Historical Quarterly, Western Historical Association conference. And that panel was about, I don't remember what it was called, but one of them was about sort of failure. One of sort of the topics, it was, had various topics, but it was these scholars at different levels, right? But I think they were all like either at least associate professors, and maybe some were full. But this person, and her name is Kelly Lido Hernandez, and I might not do justice to what she said, but this is how I remember it, right? She by then had won all sorts of awards and was very well published, right? Very widely published. And she said something that shocked me. And she said that all her publications had been rejected at least once. And I thought, oh my God, And then she said, and in fact, I send out these drafts to journals or to publishers before I know they're ready. And that was sort of really revealing to me. And I thought, this is incredible, because this isn't some scholar who who's not publishing. She's publishing, and she does this. And I thought, this was sort of like really changed my perspective in many ways. It was one of those panels, like I don't go to many panels that completely change your perspective, right, on things, but that one did. And since hearing her say that, I've started sort of doing the same thing. I'm like, okay, this article is not perfect, but I'm going to send it out and see what happens, right? And I don't necessarily think they've gotten rejected, but I've gotten feedback where that's probably harsher than if I worked on it a little bit more. But I've learned that sometimes, what I think is really important in an article that I have to really make sure I do and work on, and I submit it, and then I get feedback from, two editors or three reviewers, and it's completely different than what I imagined they were going to be, that's going to be the problematic part of the article. So I think there's sort of a truth to sort of sending it out before you think it's completely ready, because you never know whether the things that worry you are going to worry other reviewers.
Fantastic. That's great advice. You've mentioned Kelly Lytle Hernandez. Are there other writers or books that you look to for inspiration in your own writing?
So another person in my own field is Lorena Oropesa. She's a professor now at UC Berkeley, and she wrote her most recent book is The King of Adobe, and it's a book about this Chicano movement leader whose name was Reyes Lopez Tijerina, who was very controversial. It's about his controversial life. But Lorena is a friend, and she's I know that she used to be a journalist, and I think that's what makes her writing so vivid and so sort of engaging to me. But Kelly Lytle Hernandez also, her writing is just excellent. While I was writing my book, I read several books and articles by Vin Thanh Nguyen, who's the Pulitzer Prize winning writer. But in particular, he won the Pulitzer for something else. But I read a book of his. Now I'm going to have to remember the name of it. Nothing Ever Dies, sorry. And it's about the history and memory of the U.S.-Vietnam War. And because what he was saying was so relevant, because I was studying, my book is about the history and memory of the U.S.-Mexican War. And because there's these similarities between both wars also, I just completely enjoyed what he had to say. And I've just been a big fan of his writing, his articles, his fiction. So that's also, I think, something that I like to read. But another person that I read in graduate school, I read an early version of chapters that became her book, is Susan Lee Johnson, who's a historian of the American West. And I read early chapters of Roaring Camp, that was also an award-winning book. And the one of the chapters that I read was on history and memory of the a so-called social bandit in the gold mines, in the California gold mines. And that's when I started sort of thinking about, I can write about the history and memory of some event. And so that got me thinking about, sort of history and memory. And I kept reading about it, even though my first book wasn't about that. But her writing is just wonderful. And I like how, I like these writers, academic writers, who sometimes throw in a little humor. Sometimes it might not be like, it's not laugh out loud funny, but it's, it's something that makes you think, oh yeah, that's sort of funny. And I like that. And she does that. So I enjoy those kind of writers.
Susan Lee Johnson is a big reason I'm a historian. So I love to hear
excellent.
that name.
Yes.
mentioned.
Yes. And I'll say one other one that I'm sure other people have mentioned to you, but that's Anne Lamott. Early on in my writing, and when I was dissertating, right, I read Bird by Bird, her book about writing, and I just love that book. And so I've kept reading her other books, about life experiences, and I love the way, sort of her honesty. I think I would say the way she sort of writes. In her writing, you can see that she's sort of describing her vulnerabilities. I really enjoy that because it makes someone more human to me.
Well, before I let you go, you have hinted a couple times in this conversation that you're working on something new that's different for you. Are you up for talking about it at all?
Oh, of course. Yes. So one of the things I'm working on is I'm editing an anthology on racial justice, tentatively titled Racial Justice and Policing in Texas, that came out of a conference that was held here at the university where I work, the University of Texas at San Antonio. And so I'm doing that. But the other thing, the monograph that I'm working on, my third monograph, is tentatively called Challenging Exclusion, Textbook Reform and Archive Preservation among Mexican Americans. And it's a comparative study of 4 activists/scholars in Texas and 4 activists/scholars in New Mexico in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this came out of, as a lot of projects do, out of a previous project, right? Out of my second book, where I wrote about the 4 scholars that I'm looking at in Texas and 1 scholar in New Mexico. And I found that they were really interested in textbook reform. And to me, that was surprising because I didn't know that, I've heard, in recent years, like the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, this, attempt at reforming textbooks, right? Whether it's in Arizona or censoring textbooks, I would say. And then activists are trying to not only keep, book bans from happening, but also saying we need to reform the way textbooks are written, right? So when I discovered that this was going on in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was news to me. I didn't know that, right? And you might say, well, this is sort of pessimistic, like they were working on it this long and we're still working on it, right? But to me, it was sort of an optimistic thing, because I thought, oh, this proves that this has been going on for a while and this is important to Mexican American activists and has been important for a while. And it proves, that there's some perception among some people that Mexican Americans aren't interested in education, right? And, it's obviously a falsehood, but it's one of those things where you see this, and other scholars, education scholars and historians of education have proven this false, but it's just another way of sort of illustrating this problem. So I'm not sure how I'll be able to sort of grapple with, dealing with eight different activists and scholars, but we'll see. I've written a few chapters already, but I'm excited because it was sort of a new challenge, and I know that other people have done these sort of comparisons. So it's something I want to do at this point in my career.
Fantastic. It sounds great. I'm sorry it continues to be so relevant, but I think it'll be a great book for us to get to read.
Well, and that's another reason to write it, right? Because it's relevant, right?
Absolutely. Dr. Omar Valerio-Jiménez, I always enjoy talking with you. Thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past and talking about your writing process.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thanks again to Omar for joining me and to you for listening. Check out draftingthepast.com for show notes, links to books, and more. Also, for the next few months, I thought I might try out a little experiment and share a bit about the progress on my own dissertation at the end of some episodes and in the show's email newsletter. I'm taking a page here out of writer and artist Austin Kleon's book, Show Your Work, to share a little bit about what it's like to be in the home stretch of writing and revising a dissertation. And selfishly, I'm hoping it'll give me a little accountability after a bit of an unintended writing break. Right now, I'm digging back into writing the fourth of 5 chapters and facing down revisions in the first 3. If that's interesting to you at all, stay tuned and sign up for the show newsletter, because I'll probably go into more detail there. And of course, I'll be reminding myself of my own tagline, friends don't let friends write boring history.
Here at Ritual, we know that a mother's support isn't limited to one day a year, and we believe that yours shouldn't be either. So this Mother's Day, we're honoring the world's biggest supporters with science-backed daily rituals that center you not just today, but every day. Whether you're thinking about motherhood, actively trying, or already there, we've got you covered for when it matters most. From fertility support and natal choline to our best-selling clinically backed prenatal multivitamin, know that you're getting clean, traceable key ingredients in bioavailable forms. Because let's be honest, you don't have time for guesswork. Find your ritual. Go to ritual.com/podcast and for a limited time, get 40% off your first month. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Based on net sales from industry data, including Nielsen IQ, Stackline, and Numerator as of Q4 2024 and top 5 products.